Welcome everyone. We are going to review the neuron and the neural impulse this week, as well as finish up the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, limbic system, endocrine system, and completing the rest of the discussion about the brain. So let me pull up my PowerPoint. Let me get to the part where we are working on okay. So neurogenesis is the process of creating new neurons in the body. This creation is often helped by having a good sleep system, exercising, non-stressful but challenging environments that will help nurture your knowledge or your growth. Is, for example, something to kind of compare it to, if you are in school and you do not feel challenged, then more than likely it's not a very stimulating environment and you might not intake any new information. While if you are challenged and have that curiosity to continue learning, that can produce perfect, a kind of a perfect scenario for where neurogenesis can happen. Okay, so synaptic pruning occurs particularly in childhood. This is when your brain cuts down certain neural pathways that are not being used anymore. So as a kid, you are basically exploding with neurons in your head. And all these different pathways, all these different things are being learned. And what happens is that when you become a little bit older, maybe 10 to 15, you start to experience this synaptic pruning in which you become specialized in perhaps the English language versus picking up any language that is around you. That is why kids can pick up languages easier. It's because they have all these neurons running around and they're able to really form these pathways in their brain to know these things. So around 10 to 15, age 10 to 15, you start to experience the synaptic pruning. And what happens is that the neural pathways that are not constantly tread on or even seldomly tread on are cut off. And so you experience this forgetfulness. You forget, you know, perhaps you grew up learning German from your housekeeper until you were 7 and you had a pretty good grasp on German, but now you're 15 and you can't remember any German. This is because your brain pares down only the information that you use frequently and kind of cuts away those pathways that are not being used. Now, neuroplasticity is a new type of term that came out just recently, I say within the last 20 to 30 years. And this is the idea of our brains being able to continue to learn and grow throughout our life. This was something that was not previously thought to be possible, at least not to the point where it's significant. But it seems to be significant that as long as we are in these environments where we are nurturing and growing ourselves, those neuron pathways will keep that process going, and we'll be able to, you know, learn new things and have this ability basically to have some neurons adopt and do the jobs of other neurons. So an example of this is if a person has a TBI and they cannot hear out of their left ear. With neuroplasticity, the neurons that would have been devoted to the left ear now go to the right ear. So there are 2 times as many neurons in the right ear, and perhaps your hearing in that ear improves. This is the idea of being able to manipulate your neurons and being able to change it in a way that when other cells die off, if you experience trauma or stress, then your brain is able to adapt to that. Okay, so just to review, we have the central nervous system. This is where kind of all the neurons go to. It's a central hub. Then we have the spinal cord, and the spinal cord is responsible for two things. The first is that it transports messages. The outer section in particular of the spinal cord transports messages from the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system, or it comes in from the peripheral nervous system maybe as a stimulus of some sort. Maybe you're touching a hot pan, so it comes in through the nerves in the peripheral nervous system and hits your spinal cord. But the spinal cord has two jobs. The first, of course, is to transport messages, but the second, which is the intersection, is when things like you touching a hot pan, like that is a stimulus, the intersection of the spinal cord has a reflex action in which the information just doesn't go all the way up to the brain. Instead, it stops where it gets received, and it goes directly back to the nerves and tells the hand to drop the pan. So when you experience acting without your own awareness, that is because the spinal cord is taking care of that information and responding to it, because it would be dangerous for you to continue holding on to that. So, so the spinal cord is responsible. The outer layer is responsible for transmitting those messages back and forth. The inner layer is responsible for the response to reflexes. Okay, so here is another chart. We might have reviewed this last week, but I just want to give you guys another chance to review it. So in particular, we have the autonomic nervous system here that comes from the peripheral nervous system. And autonomic nervous system automatically regulates glands, internal organs, blood vessels, etc. So this is an automatic process. And it's divided into two parts: the parasympathetic, which maintains body functions under ordinary conditions, just your body going about its basic rhythms. And then the sympathetic division, which prepares the body to react, so the fight or flight. So this is kind of the action, this is the more resting time. And this is just a further example of that. So we have parasympathetic here and the sympathetic here. You won't really need to know the processes involved in this, but I just want to show you just what kind of goes on in these divisions. Okay. All right. So we already reviewed the spinal cord. So now we will review the other very important part of the central nervous system, and that is the brain. So it is often thought of as the command post, the central hub. It kind of looks like a wrinkled gray walnut. It takes information from the senses, processes it, and then make decisions about it, and then sends an action plan back to the rest of the body. It is divided into separate parts. There's something called the cortex, which we will get into a little later, and it's divided into 4 lobes. And this is just a way for us to remember the types of activities the lobes complete or how they function. So we have the occipital lobe, that's responsible for sight. We have the parietal lobe, that's responsible for more hearing. We have the temporal lobe. On each side, it's responsible for the intake of the senses. And then we have the frontal lobe, which is responsible for logic, reasoning, any sort of logic and reasoning, those types of things. Okay. All right, and now we will go and discuss the brainstem. We have connected to the brainstem, we have the cerebellum and the medulla. Okay. Okay. So we also have something titled the hindbrain, which is based on survival functions, movement, reflexes. We have the midbrain, which is more movement or voluntary movement, and then we have the forebrain, complex thought and emotion. So these are just 3 different ways to think about kind of these same things that we're talking about. So the brainstem, which is the green, is in this image, the green image right here, is referred to as the trunk of the brain. It is responsible for many of the neural functions that keep us alive. So this includes regulating our breath, heart rate, and digestion. So to review again about these different lobes, we have the occipital lobe for vision, temporal lobe, more auditory processing, multisensory, and the parietal lobe houses somosensory body sensations. The cortex is involved in visual attention as well as multisensory, just being in touch with the multisenses. And then okay, the frontal lobe houses the motor cortex and structures involved in motor planning, language, judgment, decision making. The frontal lobe is proportionally larger in humans than in any other animal, and that's because we do have this ability to have complex thought. Okay, here is also the cerebellum, and this is at the rear, the base of the skull, and it's connected to the brainstem, and it's responsible for body movement, motor learning, coordination, balance, and then also the medulla, which is at the top of the spinal column, and that's responsible for breathing, heart rate, etc. So the brainstem has two kind of big parts, and those two big parts are the cerebellum and the medulla. Now, the pons is in the brainstem as well, and this is responsible for sleep and arousal. Okay, let me go back. Okay, so the prefrontal cortex is in the frontal lobe section, and it is believed that if it's damaged, it can significantly change your behavior and how one interacts socially. So, for example, there's a famous case in which a railroad worker had a railroad tie go into his head from an explosion, so through his left eye into the back of his skull, clear through, and they were able to remove it, and he lived, but he ended up having a lot of anger issues after that. He couldn't really control his emotions. His entire demeanor seemed different. He had a different IQ level as well. So it affected all parts of him, his personality, his intelligence level. So through some research, they were able to see that when working with people who have this sort of thing happen to them, it's called traumatic brain injury, that it can really, kind of mess around with all the neurons and the neuron pathways and create a completely different person in a lot of ways. So. Okay. So here's just another explanation of the different areas of the brain: frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, temporal lobe, brainstem, cerebellum. Okay, so now we will move on to the limbic system. So the limbic system is responsible with regulating our emotions. And this is supposedly located in the midbrain, and it's responsible for some of the higher mental functions. So the limbic system is composed of a few different parts and pieces. So It's structured under the cortex, the inner upper brain. The hypothalamus, and this just means below the thalamus, regulates body temperature, thirst, hunger, sexual activity, emotions, ultimate regulation of hormones. The amygdala is more of an almond shape. This is responsible for increasing memory processes during an emotional ordeal. So basically, when an emotional ordeal happens, this is the area in which it's processed, and then it is sent on to be stored somewhere else. So it's not stored there, but it's processed there. The thalamus, it's located at the top of the brainstem, and it works with triage, relays sensory information to appropriate section of the cortex, things like that. Hippocampus is a structure associated with learning and memory. Long-term memories are stored here, or formed here, but not stored, excuse me. And in certain illnesses, such as Alzheimer's, this actually affects the hippocampus, which is why it's hard for people who have Alzheimer's to remember long-term memories. Okay, located in the hindbrain, this is where the medulla, the pons, and the cerebellum are. The medulla controls automatic processes of the nervous system, autonomic nervous system, such as breathing, blood pressure, and heart rate. The pons connects the brain and the spinal cord, and the cerebellum controls balance, coordination, movement, and motor skills. Now, there's something to be said about different hemispheres. So the brain is divided into different hemispheres as well. So we have the left hemisphere, and this is responsible for sensory information from the right side of the body, motor control of the right side of the body, speech, language, and comprehension. And now the right hemisphere, motor control of the left side of the body, often thought to be handle creativity. So, you know, that it's compared that artists have really good right brains and mathematicians have really good left brains. Okay, now we move on to the endocrine system. And this is basically a communication center that uses hormones to influence mental activity and behavior. The main difference is how they communicate, which is through the pituitary glands. And the pituitary gland governs most of the release of the hormones. So all you really need to know in this case is what the endocrine system does. It produces a set of glands that produce chemical messengers called hormones and influences activity and behavior, and that the communication system is different from the nervous system. Okay, this is just a review. Hormones regulate behavior such as aggression, mating, and parenting of individuals. Hormones are often found to be present in the body for longer periods of time. So when, say, you get very angry, your hormones get, revved up and you have maybe higher testosterone. The testosterone will stay at higher levels even after you've, quote unquote, calmed down. And that is just because hormones take a long time to kind of filter through your body. And in this way, if you have higher levels anyway of testosterone and then you ramp it up and you end up getting very, very angry, it can influence your behavior, such as striking out, maybe being more aggressive. People who have higher testosterone are often found to have some traits associated with anger issues, anger management issues, and that's just because they have these hormones pumping into their body that maybe predispose them to react in that way. It's not an excuse, but it's just a way to kind of explain that process. Okay. So that is where we will stop. And we will review for next week. I believe we are diving right into gender. So I will see you then.